I think I've covered the linked data, and I hope you got an idea of sort of the basic approach and the sort of accompanying standards when it comes to linked data. And now we'll move on to the OSLC standard, which is sort of based on this idea of linked data. I had a very interesting questions during the break, which is of course natural, but it'll be a lot interesting if we can have a discussion also ongoing. So I think those questions were very relevant for many people. So please feel free to just to ask, because that makes it easier. One particular question I would like to share, if I try to remember it, was, I mean, linked data just gives you, it doesn't solve all the problems. It really just gives you access to the data in the right format. So one challenge, if you have your data in Word documents, you need to sort of move away from that before you even start thinking of linked data. So that doesn't solve that problem of accessing the data internally. You know, if you're in Word, if you put your requirements in Word, you're pretty much stuck. You need to move into sort of data before you move into information. And that's not really what linked data tries to help. But at least it gives you that vision that maybe if you move away from Word, you have a better chance of doing it. And then the other challenge was, if you have too much data in a database, if you put all your information in a very structured way in a database, how far do you go? I mean, it can get very deep if you sort of have very, very fine-grained kind of information. How much of it do you expose? It could be too much. And if you have too much, it's hard to absorb for the user of this information, the receiver of this published information. That would be too complicated vocabulary to deal with. And that is also, I mean, that's probably what this section do. You can get some guidelines and help to sort of manage that, but that's really up to you to define how much do you want to share, and how much do you keep internal. I think that was quite interesting, and that's something we notice in many of the research partners we work with. They have that; these problems are there. So, yeah. But that's what linked data doesn't help you with directly, basically. Okay, so let's talk a bit more about the standard itself. I'll reiterate on this picture before of what is the OSLC approach. I mean, OSLC takes this architecture of the internet. The web scales, and we all know that. So why not start there? And definitely why not use this linked data approach and its standards to share this information on the web? And I hope I convinced you that this is a good start, let's say. And then instead of taking these extremes of working point to point, where you work with specific tools to specific tools, maybe if you standardize the interface, basically it doesn't matter which requirement tool you work with, as long as the interface of a requirement is clear based on the standard, maybe you can still have a distributed, sort of federated architecture of your environment, but at least the interfaces are clear. And that makes the change of tools and of your environment in the future a bit cheaper, let's say. And then the approach of the standardization is to take this, just enough integration. Don't try to put all the information and integrate it, because that makes it. What do you need to get your job done? And work on this minimalistic integration, and then add to it. And that is probably an answer to, if you have a lot of data, should you share all of that data? Maybe not. Who needs what, and you just share that. And if there's more needs, then you sort of share more and more information, and do it sort of more agile integration. Okay, so how does OSLC relate to linked data? Pretty much OSLC adopts the linked data approach, if you want it in, let's say, one sentence. OSLC focuses on lifecycle product data, let's say. It's not about any data on the internet. The real focus is on lifecycle data. It adopts the standards and their key concepts that I've gone through of linked data, RDF. This concept of the sort of the triples data model is also adopted. The vocabulary or the serialization syntaxes, etc., that I've talked to. So, but what does OSLC add to? What does it do that linked data doesn't? Linked data is about sharing data. For example, linked data doesn't talk about how do you create resources. It just says this is a resource and that's how you represent it, etc. It doesn't have guidelines on when you do what or how you should sort of connect things. And that's sort of what OSLC community tries to develop. At the core specification, they try to define things. How do you create a resource? How do you update it? How do you delete it, etc. They have a concept, for example, which we will talk about more about, delegated UI. If you want one tool to sort of graphically communicate, if you want one tool to share its graphical representation of data in another tool, how do you do that? That's not really part of linked data. And that's what sort of OSLC contributes with, these kind of needs for life cycle data. Things like doing queries, how do you specify that, etc. That's what they contribute with. On top of that, they contribute with vocabularies, which is also, as I said, The RDF standards and the linked data they have a mechanism which is RDFS or OWL to define vocabularies, but they themselves don't define vocabularies. So OSLC talks about vocabularies for requirements, quality management, all these domains that are necessary for lifecycle data they have. And we will go through that list just to show what they cover. They're still minimalistic and they don't try to define everything, but they have a set that you can start with. Okay, so if we take these, Tim Berners-Lee's 4 principles, how do they apply to OSLC and linked data? Oh, we've talked about linked data. Use URIs as names for things, and that's what they do in OSLC. Every artifact, a requirement, a test case, everything has a URI. That's what you do, of course. And then you should use HTTP for people to look them up. And that's also, of course, what they do. They apply the HTTP method to get a resource, you do a get, which is the HTTP verb to actually get a representation of the resource. If you want to delete it, you send the command, the operation delete. And this is the standard REST sort of methods to do that. When someone looks at a provide, they adopt this RDF and Sparkle to sort of get representations of OSLC. And then they have, of course, you can query it using Sparkle. So Sparkle is part of this RDF standards, family of standards, and that's how you query RDF data. So it's the equivalent, let's say, of SQL if you work with databases. For RDF, then you work with Sparkle. And of course, then it's sort of the whole basis is this triples and triple sets and graph models. And then, include links to other things so you can discover and then query your data. And OSLC artifacts, they link between resources. So you have things like validates requirement or tested by test cases. These are kind of the properties that OSLC defines to link different resources from different domains. Okay, this is how the autonomy of the standard. They have, let's say, 2 main sections. You have the OSLC core specification. That's sort of the basis for all OSLC specifications. And then you have these different domain specifications. The core specification talks about how you should use the standard, how you should define these specifications. How should you use RDF, how you should use FTP, etc. Yeah, and then the domain specifications are more the vocabularies. What does it, for the change management, for example, what does a change request look like? What are its properties, etc.? These are defined there. This is the vocabularies for the different domains. Okay, the way they do this is to define the vocabularies. Is they, sort of the working style to define this vocabulary is that you start with it's incremental and scenario based. They define a scenario like a requirements tool. An engineer working in requirements want to connect a requirement to a change request. So you set up that kind of scenario, and then you define based on that scenario what is the minimum set of resources and resource properties we need to support this scenario, and then you define the requirements, the vocabulary on that, and then you release that specification. And then you sort of add more and more scenarios to do it. So really the specification depends on the community contributing with these scenarios and driving the industry needs. What does Scania need? Then you sort of contribute with this. We need this kind of support. Then they add it to it, and you need to push that incrementally all the time. So it's alive all the time, let's say.
Question. Do you have working groups in these different kind of working areas for these vocabularies, as these are the keys used when operating together?
Yeah.
Somebody has to make the vocabularies anyway.
Yes.
So if it's free to do, then you are in a big mess. But if it's very tight, it's also difficult. So you have to have tools for the vocabularies.
The tools for the vocabularies. I can show you how the vocabularies look like today in the standard, but they try. The first question is about the work groups. Each of these domain specifications is driven by a work group. So you join a work group, and originally it used to be part of this open services. So it's an open work group. It doesn't really. Everything is public, and there's very low thresholds to join, and then whoever joins contributes and affects how these specifications look like. And now they're moving into parts of this specification are moving more and more towards in the OASIS standard, just to get more, I guess, structure out of it. But a lot of the work is still done in the open domain with the openservices.net. Yeah. One thing I like, I will show you how the standards look, the specifications look like. It's just a HTML. It's like easy to read, easily accessible also. So if you add this threshold of tools and stuff to it, then you're making it that bit harder to work with. Does that answer what you were after? Yeah. Okay, so these domain specifications work on the vocabularies. What does these resources mean? What kind of properties they should have? And they're minimalistic, and they're driven by scenarios. The core specifications is sort of the guidelines on how these specifications should look like. And they cover common issues such as versioning of resources, or how should the graphical, this delegated UI that I will talk about later, how should that work, irrespective of which domain you work on. This is the standard. The fact that you should use RDF, the fact that you should use this RESTful architecture, etc., is done in the core. Okay? So the specification talks about how, and then these are the what, the vocabulary. I don't like animation, so I'm surprised. Okay, so let's look deeper on the core specification, and then we will also look at one domain specification. We take requirements as an example.
Would it still be a point to use just the core?
Yeah. You can if you I mean, the core will give you guidelines on how you define the domain. The domains are minimalistic, so in most cases you want to extend the domains or even come up with your own domains, and that's why you will rely on the core to do that. So naturally you will look at the existing domain and say, okay, how much of that can I reuse? But they're so minimalistic that in most cases you want to extend it, and that's what we will actually realize in the afternoon also. And then the core is there to do it. And it's sort of part of the standard that you should extend it. So I'm on the extreme side that this is so little that this is the most important part, the core. Especially in certain industries or organizations where you have really domains like organization-specific tools. It's impossible to find standards out there that will support your particular information. And then you'd need just to work on the core level and define your organization-specific domain specifications. Yeah. And they don't have to be public. You can still use them. Yeah. But then if you purchase a tool, hopefully that tool, I mean, all organizations work with requirements. So of course, if you purchase a tool, you'd expect that to follow the minimalistic requirements specification. Okay, before we get into the core specifications, how do we, which is a core concept here, is how do we, what is a tool? Or I talk about the data source, how should we view that? The OSLC has these 4 concepts that I want to go through, but the central organization concept of resources, I mean, every tool, it's a data source and it exposes resources. But if you think of any tool, most tools have somehow a way of organizing resources. It could be your project or a module or a requirements module, for example, in requirements. And this is like a central thing which translates to this concept of a service provider in OSLC. That's like, it's also a resource. And this is the resource that you, sort of your starting point, let's say. If you want to be able to create a resource, it has to have a context. When you create a requirement, in what context do you create a requirement? If you have certain tools, it could be the project you want to create a requirement in, or a requirements module. And this is what you define as a service provider. And this is sort of, that service provider becomes a description of all the services you have available to do something with resources. So it's actually, you say, in a service provider, you're allowed to create resources. You can get resources. You have these kind of delegated UIs, you have these creation factories, etc. It's the placeholder where you have services for your resources. And so this is the first thing you want to do when you implement the OSLC, is to identify this organization concept of your tool. Is it your project? Is it, what more could it be? A module, or, yeah. Can you relate to that somehow in a tool of your own? And then, okay, so this is service provider. And then in a tool, you can have many projects, of course, so that's why you will have many service providers. And then we have this concept of service provider catalog. And that's like sort of the point where you go in and then you look at, it sort of lists the available service providers. So to navigate into finding a particular service provider, that means project or module, you start with a catalog. And then you get a list of service providers, then you say, okay, this is the project I want to work on. And then you start there. And then you can look there and navigate, okay, what are the services being available from that? I can do this. Then you navigate down. I want to create a resource. I want to get one, etc. I want to query ones, etc. And this is sort of the services, and through the services you manage resources. I'll jump to that picture just to show you what I mean. So a service provider lists a set of services, and what kind of services OSLC defines in the core. It could be how to create resources, how to query to find your resources, some sort of query capabilities based on the standard Sparkle, and this delegated UI, which is basically a service where one tool provides a GUI so that other tools can. So if you're in a test environment and you want to create a requirement, you don't want to leave your test environment your test environment to create a requirement. So you can use this service so that the test environment behind the scenes contacts your requirement stall. And then that pops up, in your view, a way of creating a requirement within the actual window you're working on, where you can create the requirement, and that sort of behind the scenes creates the requirements in the tool. So it's still the requirements tool doing all the work. It's just a way of delegating the interface of creating and sort of the interface of it. So a requirements tool is managed by the requirement. A requirement is managed by the requirements tool through this delegation. This is the kind of service you could provide in your service provider. Okay, I did this just to get a better picture. How do you navigate back now? Okay, so this, I hope this is clear, the concept of service provider and catalogs and services. This is sort of the, among many, I guess, but that's like the sort of the capabilities of the core. This is what OSLC provides in the core, which is on top of linked data. This discovery capability, the fact that you can start with a catalog to find your service providers, to find out what kind of services I can do on a resource, and then actually executing the services you want. CRUD services, CRUD stands for create, read, update, delete. How do I create a resource? How do I read it, update it, or delete it? And that's the basis of REST architecture. How do I represent resources? That's also defined in the standard. How do I query resources? This delegation of user interfaces, how can we do this in a standard way again so that all tools will do it? So basically, a tool will provide its delegated UI service, and then it doesn't matter which client calls it, it will still look the same if you follow the standard. And then how do I preview? So this is about UE kind of interfaces between tools. So I think I'm pretty clear that you start with a service provider. How do you discover what you can do? So from a client side, if you want to do something with a server, providing some services, how do you get there? Well, you start with the catalog. It's like the URI that you start with. And this is what we will navigate in the afternoon with. Then you sort of find out what service providers you have, and then you sort of identify the one you want. You can query also there, of course. Then you find out what kind of services you can do. And then you say, OK, I want to create a resource. Then you do that. OK? Clear? It's pretty, yeah. And all these things are RDF resources themselves. So this is accessible. All these items are RDF, which means they have meanings and they have semantics behind them, etc., including the resources themselves. This other capability, HTTP CRUD, Simon. So this is about how you manipulate a resource. Linked data doesn't really mention that explicitly, but pretty much linked data is about accessing one with, just getting one, but it doesn't talk about how you create, delete, or update. And OSLC says, OK, let's use the RESTful architecture to do that. If you have a URI for a resource, every resource has a URI. If you send a GET, which is the most common one, OK, now a little bit of web technology. When you surf for something, you write your URI and hit enter on your Firefox. This is a GET. Give me a representation of the resource. Being humans, you get a HTML representation. But you can also change the header and say, I want it in RDF. Then you can get it. But that's like a standard one is GET. This is just to request a view of the resource representation. If you want to create an account, actually we ask you to create an account in Bugzilla. You fill in a form, right? When you fill in a form and then press the button, that's like you're making a post request. I want to create an account. And this is the vocabulary of the whole, this is the basis of HTTP, where you have 4 verbs to define what kind of request you're doing on the URI. You're most familiar with GET, because that's what you do when you click. You get a representation. But when you fill in a form, you're doing a post. Delete, you don't really see, but that's like when you want to delete your account, you should use this verb. And that means something for the server. It means you should remove that account. And then update is when you want to update your password or something. Then you use that verb. And it's really, maybe not when you're talking web development, not all people follow this sort of standard, but that's sort of part of the standard in the web technologies to use these verbs to indicate to the server what kind of request are you making. Are you reading something or are you creating a new one? When you create something for a resource, it doesn't matter if you ask it 100 times, you will get, you're not affecting the state of the server. But if you do a post, you're creating an account, so you're actually doing something at the server side. So if you do a post 100 times, you're actually creating 100 posts. So these are sort of, for example, important, that's why you should sort of use the right verb to indicate the right information for the server. And then basically OSLC uses that kind of architecture, which is sort of the RESTful pattern. Is anyone familiar with REST, or do I need to mention anything about it? It's just an architectural style of how you should develop web services, which, is sort of the the main purpose of the service is to manipulate web resources by using these standard verbs I said. This is like the whole concept of it. Everything is a resource, and then you can do create, read, update, or delete on it. This is a resource, and then doing these different verbs mean different things for this resource. That's pretty much it. It's not about executing things or doing scripts or anything. It's just about accessing, manipulating a resource. The central idea is that it's a client-server, of course, architecture, but it's this concept of a statelessness. So when you do a get on a resource, you receive a representation of that resource, but there is no sessions between the client and the server. So the server is not aware of the state the clients are in, and the clients should not be aware of the state the server's in. So pretty much one way of seeing it is that as soon as you get a representation of a requirement, it's just a representation. It's not really the requirement itself. If you want to do an update on it, maybe you can manipulate it and then put a put request to change it. But you should be aware of the fact that by the time you do a put, maybe someone else has gone in and changed the state on that. So you haven't locked it in, or you haven't kept a session between them. And that should be part of the way you develop it. And that's sort of one way of scaling your architecture, because you're not sort of tying the client and the server with the state. They're sort of really stateless between them. And that's what makes this trend, I don't know if it's a trend, but it's quite an attractive style that people promote nowadays. Okay, that was just a side effect if you're wondering about that. So this is how, okay, now it gets a bit technical. This is how you do a request. Let's start with the example. You do a get on a bug with this ID, and this is the URI of the resource, and you do a get on it, which means put that into the Firefox and press enter. Then you sort of behind the scenes sending this kind of request, and then you get back a representation of it. If you do that on Firefox, you will get a HTML representation. Now, if you add this header, and that you'll have to do using a special program. If you say, I don't want HTML, the standard is to say text/HTML. But if you say I want application/JSON, then you will get a JSON representation of it. If you do /RDF plus XML, whatever the code is, then you will get an XML, RDF representation, serialized in XML in that one. So basically it's two things. You're saying, this is the resource. I want to do a get, so I just want a representation of it. I'm not going to manipulate it. And I want it in this format by putting that kind of header on it. You can restrict, when you get back, you can get all the properties. What you can also do is put sort of which properties do you want to, I don't want all the properties. I want the title and the status. Then you can add that to the URI. And then what you get back is a subset of the properties you want. Is that fine? Yeah. I don't know how many of these I will go through, but so that you have all this information and you have access to it, so we can explain them all. But to do a create, for example, then you have to send the verb post to your request. So then it's not enough to actually enter the thing on the URI on Firefox, to use that example. You'll have to actually manipulate the header, and then we're talking about, I mean, of course, programming this thing. The way you, right, so where do you, I mean, I'll go back here. To get a representation of a resource, you have the URI for the resource. You just say get on that. But if you want to create a resource, you have no URI. I mean, you want to create it, so there's no URI to create it with. And that's where the service provider, the context of where you create it becomes central. The service provider that I talked about before, you say, I want to create a resource, and you send it to that URI. So it's in the context of the service provider URI. You say post, and then you send the information you want to, the requirement or whatever concept you want to do. And then they create it. And this is the creation factory service. In the creations, this is when I prefer my computer over. So in the creation factory service, which is part of the service provider, this is the URI to create a resource. And that's where you do your post to do that. Yeah? That's pretty much it. This gets too technical. I'm not sure how interested you are in all the error messages and stuff. Maybe we can, if anyone wants to go into that level of detail, or how much, or is it okay just to keep it at the conceptual level? Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Actually, one thing I can mention is that associated with a service provider, when you create a factory, you have this concept of resource shapes, which is also defined by, I saw the word, that's why I want to mention it, by OSLC, which is like guidelines of what it's like a description of the resource type. So basically saying a requirement can have a title, it's got this kind of cardinality, you must have a description, etc. So another machine, a client machine wanting to create a requirement, can read the resource shape resource to understand what are the requirements on creating a resource. So it's like a description of the resource for creation purposes. Which properties must be provided, which ones can be provided, etc. And another guidelines from OSLC is this, again, requirements, I'll use it over and over again. We will look actually at the domain specifications. So in OSLC, they've defined a very relatively small subset of properties of what is a requirement. Now, of course, your own requirement tool will have a lot more properties. And then the approach is that these, according to the resource shape, should be provided. But a service provider, when you create one, you can still, when you represent a resource, you can attach additional properties to the standard. And these, the client should respect the fact that they're there and they should be maintained there. So it gives this flexibility in the implementation that all properties that are, even if they're not defined in the specification, they should be sort of maintained by the client. So they should not be removed, or it's not an error if they're there. So there's a protocol on how you maintain additional properties, even if they're not part of the specification. Okay, update, pretty much the same. I mean, in this case, you have a URI and you want to do a change to it. So the steps is that you do a get on the URI, so you have a representation of it. You modify it, you change the title or whatever you do, and then you do a put of that representation. And there is this, in the header, there is this E tag. I don't know if it's part of the header where when you do a get, you know in which state you've received it without maintaining a state. So if somehow this is used, I don't know exactly how the technology is, but when you do a put, if someone has managed to change this resource before you've actually done the put, then this will be detected through this E tag mechanism, and then the server will reject your change because you're making your change based on not based on the latest changes of that particular resource. So you can use this mechanism to have, without having a state, to at least when you do an update, it's based on the latest information. That's also part of the standard. Yeah, delete is the same. You just send the resource and then you do a delete on it. You send the method delete with the resource and then you're done. For some reason here it says may not be allowed, but all these services you can decide whether a resource should be updated. What kind of services you provide is up to the implementation to decide. Okay, so this is about the crude methods on how you manipulate resources. When it comes to representations, I don't know what that means, but I mean, basically in the service you should be able to handle more than just OSLC resources. So you can handle your own specific resources you have. All resources are defined using this RDF model, of course, as I mentioned before. And this is this open world view, but you define a resource by their set of properties. That's sort of the whole idea behind it. The one representation that you must always provide is this RDF XML. You can provide JSON, you can provide XML, but the one thing that you always should have is RDF XML, if you want to comply to the standard, of course. Yeah, and this is the other assumptions you have. I'm not sure if this is becoming the one to provide in the new standard, but somehow I'm a bit unsure. But at the moment, this is, as far as I know, it's RDF XML that you have to provide. We will work on this in the afternoon, so we will see how the different options are. Okay, this is something about links. I guess it's just links are proper, sort of how do you see this? Yeah, it's just this idea that a property, this is a bug, it's of type change request, and then it's got a relationship, and this is the URI of the object, and this is the relationship, and this is actually itself a URI itself, of course. So it's defined somewhere, and you know more information about it. It's just basic linked data. This open word assumption, one of the guidelines also is you cannot, even though a requirement, for example, has a relation to a bug, even though in the specification of the vocabulary it says this property points to a requirement or a test, you should never assume it is a one. They want to keep it open, so you can point to DAR or whoever you want, sort of thing. So it should be, the client should be prepared for this kind of flexibility, that you're not pointing to predefined. Again, it's not like in the object model where you say this property is of this type. You can have it, it's more of a recommendation, but you should be tolerant to changes in that. But that's because all the tools could vary, and then you need to somehow manage that sort of variation. So that's a recommendation they have. Query capabilities. So once you're in a service provider, you have the context. You can, as I mentioned, you can do creation factory, but you can also query. Give me all the resources with these kind of limitations. And so you write your sort of query using Sparkle language. So it's a standard language on how you do queries, starting with the service provider. So you have this base URI, and then you add to it. I can show you examples on it. And that's why this service provider is central, because you can't just grab a resource from anywhere. You need to have a context. And if you have a requirements, could be your project. And then from the project, you say, give me all the items, blah, blah, blah. That's your starting point. OK. This is just an example. Let me see if I get there. Better to take it straight on the example. So this is your service provider URI for making a query. This is you find out by asking the service provider, what is your query capabilities, and you get them, and then you find it out. And one of the properties is the URI, the base URI for your query. It will be that one. And then you add to it these sort of parameters. The where, which is sort of what property should have what value, and blah, 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 etc. And there is sort of it's quite a simple syntax on what kind of queries you do. You can, I think, it's sort of a subset of Sparkle, I don't know if I'm saying it in the correct way, but it sort of follows that, but it's very simple. So you're not meant to do very complicated queries with this sort of support, but at least the basics you can do.
Yeah. The OSLC defines how to specify the capability in server side, consume the provider side.
So if I understood you correctly, OSLC specifies how you specify the query capability. Yeah, this is actually this is the whole point of a service provider, is to allow you to identify if I have a query capability and how do I use it. So one of the properties of the query capability, it's got title, blah, 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 but it's also got the base URI. This is the URI. If you want to do a query, you can have, one service provider can have many query capabilities. For each of them, you can have the URI of how you start. And then in the standard, it's got the, what kind of parameters you can add to this base URI to do different kind of queries.
Then somehow the OSLC consumers maintain the query capability and somehow.
Yeah, you mean the entry point for the query capability. Yeah. So the consumer will probably start here, navigate to the query capability, identify it, and then they will have to maintain that to do queries from.
So when you're looking at next slide, you write some example of query from the consumer side. The next slide.
In the afternoon? Yeah.
Next slide.
In the next slide, I'm way behind now. You mean in this slide? Yeah. So the client will have to write this query.
But in that query, once the query capability is queried from the provider, then the severities and created should be written in somewhere in client side or programmers to query.
Yeah. Okay. You mean how do you actually? Yeah. So
how do I
automate it? Yeah. Good. Actually, good question. So one way is to here. Yeah. So one way for this is for the developer to know, okay, I'm querying this kind of resource, and I know it's got a severity property. Then they fill it in. The other capability OSLC provides is the query capability has this resource shape, which is a description of the way you can query capability, and it's also a resource, so it's an RDF. So a machine can read the resource shape information to understand what kind of query capabilities you can do, what are the properties and how I can query them, etc. And then you can sort of automatically then, or machine-wise, develop your query. Yeah. Which is actually quite interesting. I'm not sure, this idea sounds like something you can have out of the box as part of an SDK, that given a resource shape, you can formulate your query. Sounds like a next job. Yeah.
Small question. All the people like change also. It's just also available in JSON format. This resource shape available in JSON format.
The JSON format. This is a resource shape is a resource, is an RDF resource. And RDF resources has supports 3 different serialization formats: JSON, RDF XML. Yeah, this is the beauty of this. Is all RDF, so this just comes back to it.
Like JSONs, that's
Yeah,
why,
yeah. RDF XML. Yeah, for whatever reason. But yeah. So this is all resources and RDF and standards. You just do them. I mean, itself is a standard, so maybe it's got its own service provider or whatever. I mean, now I'm sort of spinning here, but yeah, it's just a resource.
What if the resource shape change? Should you be dynamic and always ask for the shape before you ask the question?
I get if you want to do it dynamically, yeah. The question is why would it? You mean there's a dynamics in the actual language in the tool itself that the requirements are changed? Yeah. What I relate to is, I mean, you have some tools or data sources where they give you a template on how you define your data, which means your actual data. The bigger question would be, my resource definition is changing dynamically because we're giving the user capabilities to redefine things or add properties and stuff, which means you'll have to, in your service provider, have this kind of implementation where things do change, yeah. But I mean, this resource shape is an RDF, so it's got a URI, and you do a get on it, you will get a representation. If that changes tomorrow, you do a get on it, then you will get a new representation. So if you're aware of the fact that the resource shape changes, you will probably keep that dynamic instead of doing it once at startup and keeping it. So it's flexible in that way, yeah.
So it's kind of like a schema.
It's a schema, but you shouldn't use that word apparently, because that's like the other word view, yeah. Yeah. It's a sort of more flexible schema, yeah. I don't know, you don't specify things. In a schema you specify, you describe things. Yeah. Yeah, it's more descriptive or guidelines, that kind of thing. It's nicer. Yeah. Okay, thank you for questions. I'll be happy. Where am I? Okay, so this was the basis of query capabilities. This is the syntax. It's just saying it's quite basic, kind of restricted on how, not make it too complicated. Again, keeping it simple so it's usable. Details. And that's how it could look like. And the question is, how do you build it? Either a developer has to write this down because they know about it, but you also have this powerful resource shape capability that lets you do this dynamically. So basically, you read the resource shape, and then I can imagine somehow a graphical thing where the user can fill in the different properties, and that is dynamically created, and then you do your query. Okay, delegated UI. I'm not sure how I manage, but at least I have more space to explain it now. Basically, you're in one tool, and for whatever reason, you don't want the developer or the user to sort of move to another tool to do something and then to come back to it. So what you do is behind the scenes, this tool acts as a client and then talks to the other tool where you want to do something and ask it, okay, give me a representation of a UI where I can let the user do something, create or look at something. And then the user gets this interface, they do whatever they want to do and then enter, and then that gets back done there without them leaving their own environment. The nice thing is that you do that, so the hosting tool that you're sitting on doesn't have to implement how a requirement looks like. You just go and ask the requirements tool, give me your representation of how I create a requirement. Then you get that. The user fills that in and then it's sent back. And then, of course, there's a communication, so you get back a link to what you've created so the tool can use it. So that's just an example about you're in some environment and then you say, I want to create a new, what are we creating? A new work item. Behind the scenes, this will talk to the work item service provider. You get this pop-up, which is a whole different environment where you can, this is actually, so there's 2 types of delegated UI. Creation, where you're delegating the creation of a resource, or what's the other one called? Selection, where you can do a query. So here you want to link a test case to a work item. So how do you find the work item to link to? You click on new, then you pop up this, the work item provider will pop this up, and then you can do a search to find the work item you want. And that's all done by the work item provider, so you never have to implement this. And then you say, OK. And that is selecting it, and that link for that particular one is given to the host, which is the test case provider. And then you can do whatever you want with that link. It could also be create. So instead of popping up for a work item that exists, you can also say, I want to create one, and then link to it. And that's actually what we'll do in the afternoon. And then you have another provider, a delegated UI for creation, where you can do that. You do this, the provider of this, of course, being a server, it doesn't care who links to it. It could be the test case, it could be requirements. It's one interface, and then many people can use it if they follow the standard. Yeah, it's nice functionality. Yeah, so basically you have delegated UI for creation selection. I don't know why we don't have one for update. We'll have to ask OSLC, but it would have been nice also maybe that you can update the requirement while you're doing it. But maybe my speculation is, it's not in the scenario, so we didn't have to do it because no one has asked. Or it could be more technically, I don't know actually, why. The whole delegated UI builds on the web technologies, so your client will have to somehow have support for having a web window. So this window here is actually like a client web, a web client basically. So you'll have to, in the client, have that kind of technology to be able to do it. So that's sort of a constraint on what you can do it. And then they have, I don't know all the technical details here, but there's sort of two approaches to do it, depending on what is available and what your preferences are. But that's all defined in the standard. So if you follow the standard, you choose which one of these two you want to do, and then the client can work accordingly also. Okay, I think I've said all that, so I hope it's clear what this creation dialog is. Another kind of delegated UI, not delegated UI, they call it UI preview, is if you're in one environment and you have a link to another resource somewhere else, you can just hover over it, and then you get a representation of that resource. And that information is coming from the source. So you never sync, you never make copies of things. As soon as you hover over, this client is going to talk to the server and say, give me your UI preview, and then that pops up in whichever format you have. And they have like two formats, small and large, so you can choose from. And that's pretty convenient also. You never even have to leave. You never have to leave your environment. You can get quick information on this. Being linked, then it's easy. Yeah? Can you imagine using that as useful? Okay, so this is core, and this is what you can get for free if you follow the standard. I'll give one example on the domain specifications. Again, the domain specifications defines the vocabulary, assuming these core capabilities. And as an example, I thought we can go through requirements. But I thought we can just have a look at all the available domains in core that I've been currently working on. And it's an unofficial invite. If you think something is missing, you can always start your own work group and sort of try to gather industry force behind it. And that's what we do in the research projects, to create more of these domain specifications. They have things like change management, configuration management, quality, requirements management, asset management, which is more general, I guess, beyond just software, and automation, etc. There's really a long list. If you're interested, we can go through it, but that's just an example of, I thought, the ones you might recognize. You want to see more, or is that good enough? They just have that.
Change and configuration management is still active. When I'm looking at the last time, the technical group does not work at those two. Yeah. So they're again being an open sort of. It's sort of where the effort is and where the interests are. So they are in a different maturity level and activity level. Some of them are settled and then they're working somewhere else, or it depends. It's really behind the community where they want to focus on. Yeah. So change management is, it's relatively small and relatively stable, and I'm not sure if there are activity there. The big activity we're aware of is here, configuration management.
In the new configuration management spec, which is called change and configuration management, by the way, it's CCM. So like all artifacts related to change management are part of the configuration management spec. And this new CCM spec is actually being developed in Oasis. So not anymore on OpenService.net. So all the activities are on the Oasis side, actually.
This one is on Oasis.
Configuration and change.
Which is not even?
Oasis, the standardization body. So Jad was talking about that in the morning. So the OSLC community is transferring some knowledge from OpenService.net, which was the open community before, into Oasis, which is like a formal standardization body. So this configuration management spec now is being defined in the context of Oasis and not anymore in the context of OpenService.net.
So some of this is work groups in this open
services.net, and some of it is into Oasis. Yeah. And I'm not sure what the strategy is, or what that is not. I'm not aware of. Yeah. But things are. I mean, Oasis is still open, so you still have access to the standards, I think, right?
It's still open, but
yeah.
it's really more formal.
It's more formal, yeah.
Body, you need to pay some membership fees if you want to attend to the technical working groups. Yeah. The process for accepting inputs for those specs is really more formalized than in OpenService.net.
Yeah. OpenService was just a community of but still, you can still contribute to the open services. This is where the scenarios are collected, and that's where you can do changes. And then it's a maturity level, I guess. Yeah. Okay. So let's look at, my suggestion is we can look at requirements, because that's not the one we're looking at in the afternoon. Then I thought you can get two. But it's also quite simple. It's just requirements. This is where I have to go on the internet. I'll just show you how a specs looks like. And that's, for some reason, that's what I've found. So when I did my PhD, I started working on the step. I looked at the step standard, which is like from this mechanical, if you work with CAD and sort of hardware. And that was just a nightmare. It's like, I mean, it was impossible. It's like tons and tons of documentations, and it's impossible. They define information models and how you define your CAD models and stuff. So it's like an interoperability also. But it's a huge meta model, impossible to read. Many APs, just understanding how you even navigate in this information was impossible. So I thought it was really nice when I read this one, because it's just a HTML page. It's a Wikipedia. You can go in and edit it yourself even, I think, if you're a member, or if you just need an email address or something. So here I am. Is this still big enough? Yeah. So this is at openservices.net, so it's open, available, and you just need an account to, you just need to join to even contribute and join the meetings. I'm not sure how active the requirements management specs is. This one is from 2012, but requirements are pretty stable. But it just gives you an idea of how it looks like. Long table of content. They have some introduction, just explaining what OSLC is and what is the purpose of the requirements management. And then they just have some terminology on very informal, what the resources are. It's just the introduction. And then they have a section on the compliance. So how much of the OSLC core specifications we will apply on this specs, and how many, what is it we will adopt and what is it we won't adopt, kind of thing. Some of these things are compulsory, so all domain specifications must do. For example, resource operations, how do you manipulate it? You must, the service of this domain must support the operations via standard HTTP operations, which means get, standard means get, put, delete, and update. This, I think all domain specifications will have that, because that's what core will probably recommend. But here you can have variations on what we might provide and not provide. I don't know what it is. OSLC services may support partial update of resources. So we don't have to, to be compliant with this specification, it's not a must that you can have partial updates, as in update certain properties and not the others. So this is, query capabilities must be supported, etc. This is about versioning and namespace. And every domain specification has a namespace. A namespace is where you refer all the properties and resources you're defining. Being RDF, you have to have a URI, and they will be within this blah, blah, blah /RM. So they belong there. But these specifications themselves can use other namespaces. For example, in core, OSLC core itself has a namespace. That's where you define the resources, service provider catalog, etc. So they will be referenced here. DC terms is the one I showed you before about things like properties like creator and stuff when it comes to authorship, I think it was. They make use of that. And that's the beauty of linked data is there are, friends of friends is things like social networks use, how you identify a person, connections between linked data and Facebook, LinkedIn and Facebook and all that. If you follow this standard of friends, you get that semantics away. So this standard will use these domain specifications also, which are outside of OSLC, to reuse that information. And that's pretty powerful also. So the creator of a requirement could be a URI pointing to the person on their Facebook homepage if they both follow the standard. That's okay, blah, blah, blah.
But this is a lot of information. But the main part here would be this resource definitions. This is the vocabulary of the resource. And the main component here is this resource called requirement. And here you have some descriptive text of what is a requirement. Of course, that's just text. And then here you have the type. So this URI identifies the type of a requirement. So if you ever go on the internet and find a RDF resource that have this type, you would know it's a requirement according to the OSLC standard. And if you go there, you will see a description of what a requirement is in RDF. So, which is basically this table, but in RDF format. So again, this is HTML for us to understand the standard, but there is the equivalent RDF standard that defines that. Should we try that? Working backwards is. So if you go to this one, I've never done this live like that. So I ended up, actually, because this I'm asking HTML here, right? I didn't say accept RDF. So I ended up on the description of the requirement resource in HTML. Now, if I can manipulate the header here, which we will do in the afternoon, then I will get the equivalent, but in RDF XML or in JSON if you want to. Yeah. Okay. But anyway, back to HTML. Here is the type, and then here you see, this is a table where you just simply list the properties of this resource. And this title is the property name, but you notice that this is actually not defined within the OSLC domain. They're borrowing from this other DC terms. There's another domain specification that defines what does it mean to be a title. And they're reusing that instead of defining our own. So if you're in your organization and want this concept of title, don't create your own. Might as well use something that exists. And that's when you get things linked better. How often should it occur? This one means exactly one. So you expect the requirement to have a title, one. Read only, they didn't specify there should be read only. What kind of value type is, at this case, it's an XML literal. You can have other properties which are string. For example, let's jump to another one just to continue on the other ones. Creator, who has created this requirement? Again, it's not defined here. It's actually, you can follow this standard instead. And here you say that the type of it is a resource. So this is actually a pointer to something else, which is where the creator is. A detail here. And then here, any is actually this idea I said before. The range. So it's a creator is a of value resource, and it could point to any. So for some reason, you don't want to say it's pointing to. See, it's pointing to any. And they say, it's likely that the target resource is a friend-of-friend person. I mean, if you were more strict, you would say that the range should be, this should stand here, f of f person. Then you're saying, this creator property should point to a resource of type friend-of-friend person. But they don't do that. They say only, and then okay, in the text description, they say it should be that.
I have a very small question. How do you integrate local and global resources?
Local and global.
Yeah, you know that you can utilize both.
Well,
create some sort of a local resource like global.
You mean like a blank node? Like when you say local resource, it's only within. So if I understand you correctly, in linked data you can have, so resources, when you just say resource or a global resource, everything has a URI. But sometimes you have resources which should not be accessible from the outside world. They're like sort of a struct or something within another resource. Yeah.
Kind of how do you utilize the software itself utilizes the internal resources?
Okay. Yeah. Well, they'll be. This is probably where you have. I think you're referring to this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So here you're saying this, whether this property is a. Oh, you mean whether it's a resource or a local resource? Yeah. What does that mean then? Yeah. Okay. So I guess in the specification here they're saying. Okay. So for the question is, what does this mean if the representation, I think that is called, the value type. So creator, it's either a resource, which means it's something that has its own URI, I can find it later, or it's a local resource, which means it's just inline within the resource. It's not available outside with its own URI.
As you may create any time, any temporary resource.
Yes, yeah, it's like a temporary one, yeah. And I guess this is saying in the specification, when you implement according to the specification, you can choose whether you want to have a person, whether you want the creator to be a global entity that people can refer to and access from the outside, or if it's local to the requirement resource. I guess that's what they're trying to say. And then it's up to the implementation to do it. What I know is that, I can mention that OSLC Core is, the official one is version 2.0, and now they're reviewing, anytime now there will be version 3.0. And I know that there has been discussions about what this means, interpretation. So that's like it's not as clear cut yet as it is. I haven't read the emails, I just know the headers. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, valid question. But then back to this one, is really, yeah, it could point to anything, and that's really how the client should work. Should be quite defensive in the way that when you get a creator, you can change that it's a person, but it could be a cat also. I don't know. That's how they work. So most of the cases, it's any, actually. That's it. This is how you define a resource, and then you list the properties to it. And now we're looking at the HTML version, but there is, of course, the XML variant of that, both for the resource, but also for each of these properties. You will have an RDF representation of that. And here you see this is actually elaborated by, so what I've seen here is the kind of properties like, modified, when it was created, who created it. And then here you get into connections to a change, for example, a change request, which belongs to another domain. So this property, this property tracked by for a requirement, it's still defined in the domain of requirements management, this particular domain, but it's actually pointing to a change request, which belongs to the change request domain. So they're using these properties, you can link information between the different domains, like you do. So you don't have to be within the one domain. I wanted to see, so these are properties. Yeah, that's pretty much it. You could even reuse properties from other domains. That's what I was looking for, but I don't find a case in this case. So you can use a property being defined from the change management request in here, but they didn't have that case here. Okay, so it's just about reading this one, and then you understand how a specs looks like. I think my impression is that this is quite lightweight understanding. But again, it's very minimalistic. It just says requirement, and these are the properties. If you go for an requirements management tool, it can have a lot more properties. And that's fine, but they don't try to put everything in this specification and try to standardize it. They standardize the minimum that is needed. But in the core specification, it says when a tool implements this one, it's very fine if it sort of when you publish a requirements resource, it can have all the other properties with it, and the client using them should respect them and not delete them or ignore them. So when they do an update or something, they keep whatever additional resource properties exist in the implementation. So, and that's part of the guidelines you use. Does that make sense? Yeah. So another resource they've defined here is this resource collection. So generally when you work with the requirements, one requirement doesn't make sense. Maybe you have a module of resources or a collection of requirements. And then they have a requirements collection resource, which has its title, description, etc. And I assume it's got one property would be the set of requirements within that collection, which would they have their own URI, etc. Oh, I'm so good at time, actually. I'm impressed. Okay, so this is pretty much it. I don't know how much more. And then they have specifications how you do creation factory, query capabilities, etc. I don't think it's so interesting. Oh, it's interesting, but it's. But what you can find from here could be relevant is the. Somewhere you can actually look at the. Okay, so I'm looking at the specification here, but if you go one step up, I don't want to go there because I see I'm running out of time. You can look at the scenarios behind this. Where is the source of this requirements? What does it look like? If you read the scenarios, you get a better appreciation of why they've included and or excluded certain things. So that's also, I think, part of the work group is the specs, is the scenarios, I would say. Okay, did you get a fair idea on requirements? Anything more? No? So if you're in your organizations, you just define that kind of thing. You define your resources, your properties following this format, and then you have a standard for your organization. If you think it's general enough, maybe you can start something at open services to sort of make it more standard so that when you buy a tool, it's sort of compliant. Okay, I don't actually have a lot to share. It's good. Oh, okay, I'm done actually. Okay, that was it. So I hope you got an idea of the what.
what is the standard like, and sort of its capabilities and features. And we will work through an example in the afternoon. And so you get all the code, you don't have to write code to start with, but we can be flexible on what we do also.